All right, so we're just gonna go ahead and get started. All right. All right, so topicality. Um, Topicality is fun, not. All right, for some of us it could be fun, but topicality in debate is super important um, for a couple of reasons. I think that, or the purpose of a topicality, let's start there, is basically for debate purposes, it's an off-case argument, right, that defines or determines what the resolution and what debates about the resolution should look like. Okay. So for example, this year's resolution is resolved. The United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, and sentencing. Okay. And for debate, actually, you should get into the habit of knowing what the resolution is, only because sometimes when you're negative, the affirmative reads impromptu, or not impromptu, but reads affirmatives that sometimes you question whether they're related to the resolution that you've been discussing in class or discussing with your coaches. And sometimes when we don't understand what the aff is and how it relates to the resolution, that should ring alarm bells that maybe the affirmative is not following the resolution, or it's not following portions of the resolution, which has you a little confused. Okay, so all that to say is make sure that you know this year's resolution word for word, if not by the end of camp, right? Then as soon as you can. Make sure you memorize word for word the resolution that you will be debating for the rest of the year, right? But the purpose of topicality is, yeah, to limit the debates that you're allowed to have based on the resolution. And I don't know if you got it from the topic lecture, but this topic, or you've discussed with your coaches in lab, this topic is super big. There are hundreds of affirmatives that you could potentially talk about this year. And that's a problem, because for the affirmative, at least, it's a good thing, right? That they have different options and different things to talk about when asked. But when being neg, having too many affirmatives to talk about is an issue, because you can't prep and you can't prepare, or you can't really be ready to have debates about apps that you weren't ready to do, or you didn't know you had to do research on. Okay, but we're going to discuss that a little bit more later. All right, but yeah, purpose of topicality is to limit the debates that you want to have, right, based on the resolution or based on the wording of the resolution. So for example, right, let's say that, think about it. What does it mean to be the United States federal government? Like, what does that include? What does that entail? How many different ways can we define what the United States federal government is? There's so many, right? You can say that the federal government is the three branches of the United States. That's one definition. You could also say that the United States federal government is the people who vote for their elective officials, right? You can say that the United States federal government is the 50 states, right? Or you can say that the federal government is the 50 states and any other US territories and military bases, or in this case, I guess, territories, right? So picking a definition is super important. So if we stuck to, for example, the definition of the United States as it being all 50 states, including territories, oh my God, right? Now I have to research about all of the 50 states and their policies in relation to criminal justice reform and how they operate. Not only that, but now I also have to talk about or look into territories that are US territories. That's like 50 plus different laws and policies that are under operation and have different procedures about how they address the criminal justice system. Just thinking about it as a negative, I'm like, damn, where do I start, right? Like, there is just so many different things that the affirmative can discuss, right? But for the negative, topicality helps shrink those debates down to whatever you want it to look like, right? So for example, let's say that you're like, you know what, 50 states plus territories, that's a lot of things to research. So let me limit the definition of the United States federal government, or let me pick the definition that says the three branches of government. right? Not now, you don't have to focus on the 50 states plus territories. Now you could only focus on how the 3 branches operate and their agencies, as opposed to, you know, all 50 states and its territories, right? That's the greatness, or that's the benefit of topicality, right? It limits and shrinks the debate to however you want them to look like as a negative. Like what negative, like what AF debates do you want to see, and what discussions do you want to have, right? Topicality helps limit those, right? When developing your, or when starting off the, what is it, the picking your T argument, or even when you get the resolution in the beginning of the year, like during camp, for example, it's helpful if you research and circle important words in the resolution that you think require defining, right? I picked the United States federal government for the example earlier, only because it's the easiest and it's right there. Or I can come up with impromptu interpretations. But in the instance of this resolution, I would definitely define words like enact, substantial, criminal justice reform, forensic science, policing, and sentencing. Because just by reading it on face value, I don't know what any of that means, and I don't know what any of that looks like. And I don't know what neg ground I have, or what af ground I have to talk about just by reading it on face value. Therefore, Googling each word that you think is important or makes up most of the resolution is a good place to start. Another good place to start to investigate what af and neg ground exists, or by neg ground and af ground, I mean what things can the affirmative talk about and what things can the negative talk about, right? Another good resource is the high school topic paper, right? Every year, a committee of folks or a group of folks write an essay or a paper on why this resolution would be beneficial for debate. And that's a good place to start in order to understand how the resolution was meant to look like, or how these debates were meant to look like. That's not to say that you should just stick to that interpretation of the topic paper that's published. You can definitely create your own spin and be creative about the affirmative and negative strategies that you come up with. But it's, again, it's a good place to start, especially for the open kids who have, you know, you're literally allowed to talk about anything and create any kind of affirmative that you want. If you don't know where to start, the topic paper is a good one, or Googling each word that you think is important. Okay. But when you're Googling, right, now that you've done like the superficial Googling and reading the topic paper, and now you're looking for specific definitions to help you limit some of these debates, now you're like, okay, I want debates to look like this, or I want to talk about this on the negative. Like if you're a K debater, that's awesome. If you're a policy debater, that's awesome. If you're both, that's awesome, right? Just start brainstorming as to how you want debates to look like when you're negative, but also when you're affirmative. So when picking some of these definitions, right, it's helpful if you pick definitions that are relevant definitions to the resolution. So for example, in this case, it'll be legal definitions, right? So things like Harvard law, or specific government definitions of what the law looks like, or what the law says word for word, are the best and ideal sources that you should look for to search for some, or to grant credibility to some of your definitions. Because in topicality, this also becomes a big part of the debate later, right? For example, if you run a definition that's words and phrases, right, or dictionary.com versus, I don't know, Harvard or Stanford law, and the definition was created by a I don't know, some sort of law professor who has all of these credentials, right? So again, the scholar or the Harvard law scholar will always be more credible than dictionary.com. All right, so don't be lazy, right? And search for different definitions that are by qualified experts in their field that are related to the resolution, right? If it could also be a political or any political source, an economic source, social, but considering the topic, right? Legal definitions from legal experts is the best way to go in order to pick a decent definition, whether it's a interpretation for T or a counter interpretation for T. And if you don't know what any of that means yet, it's okay. We'll talk about it in a second. Okay. But also, this is why topicality matters. I think that sometimes topicality is misconstrued to be like the evil boogeyman argument that, you know, that we shouldn't really talk about, or or it's a whining argument, right? Like, oh, get over it. Like, debate's hard. It is what it is. But I think there are benefits to debating and running topicality. The first one, I think that as debaters and as students, it gives us portable skills in the context of understanding our legal system. For example, there are some, I don't know if you've ever bothered to read a law word for word instead of someone's interpretation of the law, but the wording of those the law is super complicated and super in a way super specific. And I think that as debaters, if we start investigating and practicing the importance of definitions and how they apply, right, I think that that's training or helping us then to carry those skills over in different ways, such as when writing laws, or again, checking police officers when they misunderstand the law or misread the law when they supposedly cite your rights, right? I think that these are important discussions to be had. And we should start getting into the habit of doing those. So I think that's one of the reasons why topicality is important. The other one is like in everyday life circumstances, like contracts and leases, again, hyper specific interpretations that we as sometimes regular people have trouble understanding. So just getting into a habit of investigating those things, right? Even if it is just in a space like debate, it can help us further on in the future. So those are just some like educational reasons as to why topicality I think matters. But in the context of debate, topicality matters for clash, predictability, limits, and ground. So I kept saying earlier about how you want these AF and neg debates to look like, right? Like you want, for example, what are the most predictable arguments? In this case, predictability is good, right? Because if you can predict what the AF says, right, then you're able to construct a decent negative strategy against the affirmative. And developing a decent negative strategy against the affirmative leads to clash, right? You're able to have discussions and debates as to why your argument matters versus their argument matters. And it's a productive conversation to have, whether it's a win or a loss, really, right? So like if you're able to go back and forth about a specific, the specific nitty gritty of a policy or an advocacy statement or specific research, then that is just more educational for those who are witnessing the debate. Now, if you look at the other end, right, at the other end of the spectrum, let's say that you weren't ready to have a debate about whatever, right, or about X, right? And I mean, I'm sure most of you have been in those situations where you have nothing against a specific affirmative, and the debate just crashes and burns after that. Like you don't know what to say, your arguments are not really well warranted, you're flustered, you don't use up all of your time. You're just like going through the motions, not really thinking about what you're doing because you just weren't ready to have that debate. And in those conversations, it's like whether you win or you lose, it's like, what did I really learn? I'm not sure. All I learned was what I don't know, and now I have to go back to the drawing board and figure it out, right? But as much as the nitty grittiness of a specific policy or investigating whether the affirmative solves or it doesn't for its harms, right? That's kind of hard to do when you didn't know that was the app you would be discussing, right? So this is why clash is important. Clash is what leads to education sometimes. And clash also, I mean, I guess in terms of fairness is also good, right? Because then both sides have an equal chance of, you know, winning or losing, whatever the outcome may be. Right. So yeah, so in debate, T is important. Like I said earlier, you have to kind of visualize what you want the neg round to look like. Okay. What arguments does the neg have access to? So for example, let's say that, I don't know, you really like running the politics dissad. Does your politics dissad, right, apply, or can you have politics debates, right, against this affirmative? And if not, then maybe even if like your most generic or your most applicable to every AF link, right, doesn't apply, then maybe you should investigate whether the AF is topical to begin with, right? And then explain or think through why politics debates matters, or why state counterplan debates matters, or why this specific critical ground matters, right? Start thinking through those things and explain why you think that they're important, okay? And I think this quote is also pretty important, right? Is that the AF has a specific area of the resolution that they defend, and the neg has one that they can make for themselves too. So in considering, and we're going to talk about this in a second when I dive into the key words in the resolution that we should try to define. This topic area is really, really big, super big, right? Like I said earlier, policing looks is a lot. Different types of policing or decriminalization of so many things, and forensic science, and the definition of the word enact, criminal justice reform in itself. There's like so many different affirmatives that are possible, right? That topicality helps in the sense that, you know, the neg can, so not only the AF gets to dictate what the conversation should be, but the neg can also dictate what those conversations should look like, right? You just have to find you have to, figure out what you want. And that's the hard part, isn't it? Figuring out what you want, right? So make sure that, you know, when you're thinking through how to run T and what T to run, right, that you come from a place of, what do I want these debates to look like? What do I want from these debates that I want to have for the rest of the year? What skills do I want to acquire, right? Start by what you want, and then you can define the rest later, okay? But figuring out what you want is probably the hardest. All right, so shout out here to Michigan Debate. You should definitely go watch their T lecture. It's a little bit more in depth, but for the purposes of camp, I pulled out only the definitions from that presentation. All of their videos are on YouTube, and I think the presenter was really, really good in talking about topicality. But yeah, so here, the first word that I think is important to define is the word enact, right? If you're anything like me, I thought enact just meant to do, right? But here, right, enact can mean many different, or not many, but it can mean a different thing in the world of the legal field. So for example, in this Wall 7 piece of evidence, right, it talks about how enact in reference to judge-made laws is unorthodox, since the term is usually reserved for legislation. However, courts fulfill a quasi-legislative function, and hence I contend that it's appropriate to use the term enact when describing judge-made law. So in the chat, what do you think enact means in this context? Like, what does that mean? How does it limit the resolution? Like, what asks are allowed under this word enact? You can feel free to type in the chat, by the way. And the answer is in here too, if you're reading it, if you can figure out where to find it. But what affirmatives do you think are justifiable or should be debated if the negative team is running T enact? Perfect, Jason. Yeah, courts, right? The court's affirmatives, okay? Or it justifies mostly courts' AFs, right? So for example, right, like I said earlier, there's different procedures and laws and agencies that are in the resolution already, that if we use the word enact to mean only courts, that significantly shrinks the debates for the affirmative to only courts affirmatives, okay? And this is helpful, like I said, if you want to have more court-based debates, or if you want to take the strategic route, right, and just limit the AF in general, right? Like, I'm just going to throw out this topicality word because, you know, I think it's good in terms of limits, or it limits the affirmative. But good, Jason. All right, the next word that I think is important to define is substantial. Now, if you're anything like me, I thought substantial meant like to reduce or increase or change dramatically, but that literal definition of substantial is useless in the context of this resolution, because substantial doesn't mean that at all, and it uses the First Step Act as a way to kind of, you know, contextualize what substantial means, right? So according to Law 19, right, the First Step Act represents the most substantial criminal justice reform legislation in a generation. The law aims to shorten mandatory minimum sentences for some drug offenses, Justice Department officials announced that more than 3,100 people would be released. The First Step Act increased the cap on good time credits from around 47 days to 54 days per year of sentence imposed, a change that will benefit up to 80% of people in the federal prison. So if we're going by this definition of substantial, it doesn't mean anything what I thought it meant, right? But if anything, it just means the shortening of certain mandatory minimum sentencing. And to be quite honest, it's not really the best T argument to go for, only because it's too hyper specific. But again, define what your purpose is and what you want these debates to look like in order to kind of, go move forward from there. The next definition is criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform has different definitions and different interpretations. So for instance, here, according to Evans, first, the concept of justice reform is so broad, it makes the term almost meaningless. The term reform, however, could also describe changes in policy and practice of a very different type. Some policymakers could think of reform as increasing police surveillance, imposing stricter sentences, or making the terms of probation longer and more restrictive. This study defined reform as a use of laws, policies, rules, and regulations to advance a more progressive approach to youth justice. In other words, the study focused on reforms designed to be rehabilitative and restorative rather than punitive. When it comes to talking about reform, this is why it's a little bit overwhelming with this topic, right? Here, this definition is helpful because it limits reform to only mean progressive action, or to see more, I guess, social benefits as opposed to punishment-oriented reform, right? Because if we just leave criminal justice reform as is, it would be justifiable to say reform means increasing sentences for X crime. Under the criminal justice reform interpretation, if we do not limit it, those types of affirmatives are allowed. Like if you also make a case that, I don't know, if the AF is increased punishment for Wall Street bankers for violating trading laws, increasing the punishment is justifiable under the term reform. But if you provide a definition, right, that limits or argues that reform to mean only progressive, right, then you are, decreasing those debates dramatically. So yeah, definitely, keep in mind that reform could go both ways. It could be towards social benefits, like for instance, increasing surveillance on cops, punishing cops, for example, that do problematic things, right? But it could also go in the other direction. Like, for example, increasing sentencing for people who use, I don't know, meth, right? That would be justifiable under the resolution as is. Therefore, limiting that definition or understanding that you can limit those definitions to only mean progressive things, right? Or something that helps society out, or it's more progressive oriented, will help those debates a lot. Okay. All right. Other folks also contend that criminal justice reform doesn't mean abolition, right? So in this piece of evidence, right, it's more so reform means to make government more effective or equitable at existing goals. So under this interpretation, things like abolishing ICE or abolishing the police, for example, or police departments would not be topical, right? Because reform, according to this person, right, means that we should, make things equitable with a system that we already have in place. We are not getting rid of it, we are changing it, right? Which is what we usually understand reform to mean. So again, pick the debates that you want, right? If you have an abolish ICE affirmative, which is in the JV and novice packets, and you'd have a debate about that if you're an open, maybe this is a topicality that you want to run, right? Like abolishing doesn't mean reform, and that is a debate to be had. Okay. Okay. Another interesting definition of criminal justice reform is that it doesn't include juveniles. It doesn't include those who are underage, right? And according to this Barbara Woodhouse, right, they argue that delinquency in criminal justice systems, delinquency refers to the conduct that would not be a crime if committed by an adult as well as to conduct that would be a crime if committed by an adult, but is handled instead as a civil matter in the juvenile justice system. The term criminal justice refers to the systems for prosecuting and punishing crimes. So this one includes or excludes any affirmatives that has to do with minors. Okay, so this is also something to consider, right? Let's say that the affirmative is something that challenges current juvenile laws, right? And you're like, oh man, I wasn't ready to have that debate. Then maybe, or I didn't, you know, or maybe it's not that you weren't aware, but you agree with this scholar or scholars who argue that the juvenile system or juvenile delinquency is not the same as criminal justice reform. Okay. Like really, it's your choice about what you want these debates to look like. As you can see, there are different interpretations for criminal justice reform, right? So you should pick based on the affirmative and based on how comfortable you are defending this definition. That's how you pick a certain T argument. I say comfort a lot because I know that sometimes T is not our argument of choice, right? And we don't want to sound like awful human beings sometimes when running this argument, which is why I say like it should be based on how comfortable you are defending a certain type of definition. Okay, now forensic science. Oof, forensic science. There's so many different categories and so many different things that you can talk about that you can change. So according to this author, right, forensic science reform means changing techniques used to solve crime. Forensic meaning scientific tests or techniques used in connection with the detection of a crime. Reform may be more easily understood as change. So you can change any of the procedures in the criminal justice area. But if you just look at it, right, there are so many things that I have to, or there's so many possible affirmatives that can advocate for changes that really it's a little overwhelming, right? So again, T helping you restrict that and limit the topic of discussion is a good one because I mean, look at this, that's a lot of Fs. Right? So limit those debates based on what you want these debates to look like. Also the issue of policing, okay? Policing is also super vague. Not vague, but it's more so in the topic, or it's connected to decriminalization, right? So anything that is policed because it's illegal, right, is a problem. So under this term, or just as simply policing, anything that's illegal in the United States is up for debate. Anything, literally anything. Anything that's illegal in the United States, it's up for debate. And this is just a few, right, that I was able to pull out. For example, drug offenses such as marijuana or medical marijuana usage, right, or drugs in sports, opiates, prostitution, physician-assisted suicide, sale of organs and tissues, gambling, online gambling, street gambling, concealed carry, public order offenses, vagrancy, homelessness, public order, abortion, all of that, right, are issues up for debate, right? And I don't know about you, but if there is no limit as to what policing means, that's a lot of affirmatives, right? And we're not even done here. I'm sure there is, I think some of the other crime, or other things that are considered a crime are things like immigration, Wall Street offenses and fraud, right? All of those things are up for discussion or are all a part of the affirmative ground, okay? And when you're negative, it's not going to be fun to be negative if, you know, you are not ready to be a certain F, only because you don't have that infinite much, or you don't have infinite time to research all the possible affirmatives that exist or that could exist in the resolution. Right? Keep that in mind, right? But here, policing, you can limit the definition of policing, right? For example, Davis 16 argues that policing reform excludes police reform, requires structural transformation of policing systems and strategies, okay? That's one way in which you can limit the resolution in the context of policing. Oof. Okay, I hope no one is lost yet, but if you're lost, feel free to drop in some commentary in the chat, and I'm sure some folks will be happy to answer some questions if I don't see them immediately. Okay. Again, different definitions for policing, right? Police reform refers to action taken to correct unlawful behavior, right? Police reform requires increased police accountability and academic consensus, right? Again, these are all different definitions that allow you to limit what policing looks like, so you're not overwhelmed by the amount of decriminalization topics or illegal things that are up for discussion. Okay. Now let's talk about the 1NC. So now that we have an idea that the resolution is topics are exploded and there's an infinite amount of things that the affirmative can talk about, right? Let's talk about specifically the 1NC, and we're going to move as to how you would structure and how would you extend and go for T in future speeches. Okay, so there are 4 parts to the 1NC. You need all 4. There's no if, ands, or buts, and maybe I can get away with just reading 3. No, you need all 4. And this is why flowing is super, super important, right? If, for example, the 1NC reads T at the end of their speech and doesn't read their impacts, yeah, the 2AC should be easy when debating the 1NC at that point. Because if you have no impacts in an argument, remember, the 3 parts to an argument are claim, warrant, and an impact. If the TR has no impact or doesn't have any voters, we're going to talk about that in a second, right? Really, there's no reason why, or no persuasive reason why we should vote on this T argument. So you need all 4. You need all 4, no ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. Some generic TRs that you can go for when you're constructing the 1NC are criminal justice reform, as I mentioned earlier, right? Criminal justice reform is super broad, and you can use specific definitions to limit what criminal justice reform means, okay? So generic TRs are also super, by generic, I mean that it's applicable to most affirmatives, if not all of them, right? Usually it's the case that UDLs have some sort of generic T shell for novices, JV kids to run that are mostly applicable to all affirmatives or that specific affirmative that you're assigned, right? But T, like I said, is a helpful strategy or a helpful tool to help you shape the debates that you want and shape or limit the affirmative arguments. Okay, so maybe find a generic T for you that you want to stick to and maybe run against every affirmative. I don't know. Right? That's a choice that you could make, or you can take the strategic route, right? Like, for example, when the affirmative tells you their plan text before the round, right? And you realize that their definition of policing doesn't fit with what you were taught or what you read, or doesn't meet based on what the research that you've done, right? Then maybe you should pull out a strategic T shell that argues that the affirmative is not topical for these reasons. Okay, like, I don't know, like if you, maybe not true, I'm making this up, but in the instance of the United States federal government, right, if I was running a decriminalization of X that's only specific to Puerto Rico, right, which is a US territory, it's arguable whether that US territory is part of the United States. Right? So like in that scenario, you can limit or strategically run T against an affirmative that you could argue is not topical simply because you used a territory, not the 3 branches, right? But yeah, you can be strategic about how you pick your T arguments. And the best way to be strategic about this is by using the wiki and by by listening to when the app discloses their plan text, right? That's how you can choose a particular T argument. But all of that to say, at the end of the day, any word in the resolution is up for debate. Any word, any, even the word resolved, like resolved, and then it's like a colon, right? Yeah, even that is up for debate, and you can make a big debate or a big T debate out of the word resolved. You could also make a T debate out of the word the, right? If you choose to. Any word in the resolution is up for debate. Any word. All right, so let's take a look at this affirmative, right? Plan, the United States federal government should defund and disband Immigration and Custom Enforcement, or ICE, okay? Do you think this is a topical plan? I kind of gave you the answer earlier, but shoot in the comments section or in the Zoom chat, right? Whether you think this affirmative is topical, right? And if so, why not? You can use the abolish, reform is not abolish definition, but I was curious as to whether you can come up with different reasons as to why that's the case, all right? And you can go back and forth with, your fellow camp members, but these are important things to think through, and something to think about, or some questions to ask yourself when you hear a plan text is, do you think this is a justifiable plan? What's the problem with this plan? Does that make it problematic for my resolution, or sorry, for my negative strategy? Why is it a problem that I can't run my usual negative strategy against this affirmative, right? Why do I think that's problematic, right? Think through those things, right? Sometimes we kind of get a little insecure and we're like, oh no, maybe I'm just not ready, or maybe my 1NC is just really bad and I just don't get it, right? Nah, let's think a little bit deeper than that, right? Maybe investigate, maybe it's not a you problem, maybe it's an AF problem, right? So maybe think through those questions when you're given a plan text. This is more specifically for the open kids, right? Instead of blaming yourself on first, right? Investigate whether, the AF is the issue and not your strategy, right? Think through that. Okay. Second, but yeah, you need an interpretation. You need a definition. Did I skip that one? Oh no. Yeah, you need an interpretation or definition. Number one, you need a definition or interpretation of the word that you choose to highlight, or that you choose to or that you argue that the AF misdefined. Okay, you need an interpretation. You need a definition, period. Like, you can't just accuse the AF of doing something bad and not have a vision of what it should look like, right? You can't just complain, right? You have to provide a counter to that, right? What is your interpretation of the word, and what is your interpretation of the resolution? Okay, you need to have one. Okay, the second part is the violation. Violation just explains how the affirmative, right, doesn't meet your definition, or doesn't apply to the definition that you've provided. It's incredibly self-serving, right? Duh, you don't meet, and here's why you violated this definition, okay? Or this is why you don't meet. But yeah, like I said, it's basically just explaining to the judge how the AF did something wrong, or how the AF doesn't meet your definition of the word. That's it. You don't have to over-explain it here. Usually a couple of sentences is enough, right, for you to explain the violation. You don't have to go too deep about it yet, at least in the 1NC. Remember, we're still in the 1NC shell. Okay, violation explains to the judge how the AF doesn't meet your resolution, and or what the AF did wrong. Number 3, this is my favorite, standards, or reasons to, also known as reasons to prefer. So in essence, the standards are the warrants, or the reasons why your negative definition is better for debate. Better for debate, better for education, better for whatever you think is pertinent to your betterness, right? What does your definition do to make things better? It's the warrant. The standards are the warrants, or the internal link. I don't want to confuse y'all, but yeah, just the reasons why your definition is good. Okay, when thinking through your standards, okay, here are a couple of tips that can help you develop those standards. So for example, one of the things that you don't have to do is overly explain the standards in the 1NC. Remember, you're short on time, and the more efficient you are in debate, the better, because time is valuable, right? So just be efficient, word efficient. That defends why your definition is best. In later speeches like the 2NC 1NR, that's when really you want to over explain, or talk about or give more reasons why, right, your standards are better, right, and or why your definition is better as compared to the affirmative. In the 2NC 1NR, that's also where you elaborate and explain the impact, or more specifically, how the standards or reasons to prefer connect to the impact of T which I'll talk about in number 4. But standards are your warrant, your reason why your definition is better. It's better for limits, it's better for predictability, it's better for ground, it's better for, it's more real world, right? It's all of those different things. All of those are standards or reasons to prefer. Another helpful tip when coming up with standards is make sure that all of your standards are different, right? If all of your standards are about ground, for example, and it's the same interpretation of ground, like my definition is best for fairness because it allows us to run our generic strategies like our politics dissent and our generic K links apply, or the state's counter plan applies, et cetera, et cetera. But all of your standards or reasons to prefer sound very similar. You're wasting time, right? Just read it once and move on, right? And then come up with a different reason, right? Or a different standard, right? That your definition is better for, or that benefits, that provides that benefit, right? Don't make it too similar, because if you do that, right, and you over explain the same thing in the block, right, or the same standard over and over and over, right, you wasted 5 minutes, and you make it so easy for the 1AR to just be like, you know what, group all of their ground arguments that say that we didn't allow them to run X, Y, and Z argument. Here's my 2 responses to that, and then they move on. That would literally take them like 30 seconds to say versus your 5. All right, so make sure that your standards are all different, right? Otherwise, you're making it super easy for the affirmative to just, come back and be like, group all their arguments. Here's my 1 argument against that. Okay, but yeah, so understanding debate jargon and standards. Look, you don't have to use limits, ground, predictability necessarily in the standards discussion, but it is helpful because for most of your judges, especially in open, those words are buzzwords that the judges usually take notes on their flows, right? But you could also explain them in different ways without using those words, if that makes you a little bit more comfortable, or in future speeches. But yeah, right. But it's important to understand those terms. Okay. But like I said earlier, make sure that your standards are diverse. Another thing that I want to highlight is that you can be creative with these as well, right? You don't have to stick to what every debater is saying, right? If you can come up with an innovative reason, or a different reason, or a creative reason why your definition is good for debate, right? That's awesome, and you should definitely go for it. Remember, there are no hard rules in debate, except for times, and that's only because judges don't want to be there for like 3 or 4 hours, right? There is no specific rule in debate. So debate is debatable, okay? So like, just because someone is like, no, this is the definition of this word, right, doesn't mean you have to accept that that is true, right? You can argue against that. You can pick one that you think is better, and that's okay. As long as you explain why, you give reasons why, and you tell me why that reason is better than what they have to offer, right? Like I said, everything is debatable, and you all have the capacity to be more creative, and maybe, who knows, maybe something that you come up with will be in debate for the next 20 years, right? So don't be afraid to get innovative and diverse with some of these standards, okay? Or some of these reasons why your definition is preferable. Another thing, when it comes to hearing standards in a T-shell, let's say that you don't know what limits or testing the affirmative or what topical version of the affirmative means, okay? Even if you don't know, right? That's what cross-ex is for. Please ask, right? There is no such thing as a dumb question in debate. There isn't. I really don't think there is, unless you're being silly and like, oh, how was your lunch? Right? Then maybe that's not a very good question, right? But if you don't know what a standard is, or if you want the other team to like re-explain what their standards are, right? Ask during cross-ex. Like, you said limits. What does that mean? And what does that have to do with the 1AC? Okay? Don't be afraid to ask. Because at the end of the day, the more everyone's clear about what we're debating about, the better these debates will be for both sides, even if you lose or win, whatever, right? If you understand what's happening and what if you understand their argument, right, you're able to answer it better. Because, you know, earlier I said clash is key to education, right? And if we can't really have productive debates about the nitty grittiness of tea or the nitty grittiness of a specific plan, right, or advocacy statement, then it's kind of like, I don't know what to do, right? And they're not the best debates. I mean, you'll still learn, but they're not the best debates to be had. Okay, but that's why you should use cross-ax to ask, right? But here are some of the common standards that you'll hear in debate. So for example, bright line, okay? Bright line just means only our definition makes it clear what types of plans are topical and what types aren't. So like in providing a boundary or a specific interpretation of, you know, what this is what these plans are and this is what this is not, right? That is better for debates because we're better prepared and it leads to clash. Look at that, okay? Education, right? Only our definition makes sure the debate focuses on the issues that are more important to learn about than the issues the affirmative plan discusses. This is a tricky one, to be quite honest, only because the affirmative always has the capacity to be educational, regardless of whether it meets the resolution or not, right? But like I said, if you can spin it in a way that doesn't sound like you're overly complaining, right? And you make a decent case as to why your definition provides this specific type of education best, right? Then maybe that's the route to go. Another thing that could be debated about is grammar. I know one time I had not capitalized the U in USFG, and that was a T debate that I lost. So make sure, so grammar could also be up for debate, or how you write your plan text could also be up for debate. Like if you misspell a word, if you didn't put the period in the right place in your plan text, that could be an issue for discussion, right? In future debates. It has happened. So make sure that you pay extra attention to what plan text you give the opponent or what plan text you put in the wiki. Okay, ground is another one that I've been talking about, and just ground, for those of you that still don't understand what that means, it just says that, you know, it's the definition is fair for both sides because the affirmative and the negative have an equal chance of providing good and strategic arguments on both sides, not just the affirmative. Okay, limits, right? Again, limits is pretty self-explanatory. It limits the discussions or limits the number of affirmatives that should be talked about, right? Intent to define, I'm not persuaded by this argument. This argument just says that we should stick to the definition of those who created the resolution or people who wrote the topic paper, because that's what they wanted us to debate about. I'm not really persuaded about this argument, and I think it's probably one of the weakest ones. It's like saying, I want this word to be defined this way because they said so. Like what? Right? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you have better reasons as to why we should follow what the writers of the topic paper and the resolution, like maybe you think there's a better reason, but for me, that's not the most persuasive argument. The expert opinion argument, right? Maybe preferring your definition because it's by experts, right? Like you have provided a definition from, I don't know, I keep saying Harvard Law and Stanford Law, or maybe any government agency, or maybe the Supreme Court defined this, I don't know, the word substantial in this way, right? And that's why you should prefer your definition, because it abides by, you know, key experts like the Supreme Court or Harvard Law or whatever it may be. Okay, and the last one is universality. I haven't heard this one a lot, but it's basically a definition that is super generic enough that everyone should have a grasp of. So for example, reform, maybe you can say it's sticking to your definition is best because it's a more universal definition of the word that everyone has access to, not just, you know, a specific side after neg, right? But really it depends on what you want to defend. You can pick any one of these and maybe make up your own in your own terms, right? And then the last one, voters. All right, so voters are important. Oh my God, right? If your T-shell does not have a voter, or also known as an impact, then that kind of really, you have no T-arg, right? You don't have an argument, because remember, an argument is claim, warrant, impact. You're missing one of them, right? So you just gave me all of these reasons why your definition is awesome, but you didn't give me why that matters, right? And in a world where you don't give me why that matters, me as a judge, I'm like, well, okay, that's cool that you think we should limit the aff, and okay, it's cool that you think that we should only stick to Supreme Court case affirmatives. Okay, right? If you don't explain why that matters, right, or why that's important, or the impact, voters are the, what is it? It's another word for impact for T. And there's only two impacts for T, and that's fairness and education. Okay, so in the 1 and C, you need those 4 things. But some tips to help you understand or grasp voters a little bit better, right, is, again, you have to connect all of your standards to the fairness and education question, right? Why is Brightline important? Well, if we have an equal, if each one person has access to a specific, if each debater is aware that this is an aff arg, this is an egg arg, right, that leads to better clash debates, right, because we're better prepared to research these specific affirmatives, right, and because we are able to clash better because everyone's aware about what we are supposed to be debating on both the aff and the neg. This is better for education because we're able to, and you see how I'm elaborating why that's important for education. This is what should happen in your 2NC 1NR debates and the 2NR. Okay, not in the 1NC. When the 1NC, it's enough to just be like a reason for fairness and education. But for later, definitely in the later speeches, explain why your standards connect to your, or how your standards connect to your voters. If you don't do that, really, as the judge, it just sounds to me like you're complaining, and I'm just always going to sympathize with the affirmative education and the affirmative in that sense if you can't connect your standards to your impact or why it matters. And the 2NR, right, you also have to do an impact calculus. Like impact calculus in T means comparing the 2NR's arguments for fairness education to those of the affirmative, right? Like, why is your education more important than mine? Why does your fairness, why is that better than my vision of fairness, right? Compare the two, right? Make sure that you're doing that comparison and telling the judge why yours is preferable in the later speeches. And these are just some questions to ask yourself before you give a 2NR. Why is your education better? Why is your definition better for fairness? Can fairness lead to education? Can education lead to fairness? Right? So just ask yourself these things, and it'll help you better to kind of compartmentalize a 2NR in a persuasive way. Okay. And like I said, not explaining your voters or not elaborating your voters or connecting them to your standards, it creates a perception that you're just complaining, and it doesn't make the T argument at all persuasive, right? So make sure that you're fleshing them out so that the judge can sympathize with your argument and not just be like, I didn't buy it, I hate it, next, right? So again, make sure you flesh them out later. Okay, so how to extend T in the 2NC 1NR? Okay, a couple of steps. First step is make sure that you extend the 1NC's definition word for word and extend the violation. And I say word for word because sometimes y'all paraphrase, and your paraphrasing is not the same as your original intent of the definition or your author's definition, or you keep moving around what it means. And in the eyes of the judge, this can become a little confusing and a little just confusing. And it's also an area where the other team can exploit it. Like, hey, even they don't know what their own definition of the T arg is. So like, why should you restrict the aff in that sense when they can't get their own interpretation together, right? So make sure that the 1NC interpretation is consistent throughout later speeches. Okay. Also make sure to not forget the violation. Remind the judge as to what the aff did wrong, as to how they don't meet your interpretation. And then the second part, this is where you, over-explain or analyze and elaborate on the standards and reasons to prefer your definition. This is where you do the work of connecting the standards and the voters together. Okay, number 3, explain why your reasons outweigh those of the affirmative, right? So like the questions that we thought about earlier, why is your impact better than mine? Or sorry, why is your impact worse than mine or better, right? Think through those questions and then elaborate them in your extension of the T shell. Steps 1 through 4, by the way, I don't know if you noticed this, it's what should go in your overview of T. So you don't have to do it robotically like the 1NC shell word for word, but this is where it's just kind of an overview, right, of the T shell. But an overview that explains and gives more reasons or fleshes out more particularly why your definition is better. And then step number 5 when extending T is make sure you go to the line by line. Lots of you just tend to read each other's blocks at each other without ever engaging each other. That's not a good T debate to have at all, because then you leave it open for the judge interpretation. But if you're serious about going for T, make sure you go down the line by line of the 2AC block if you have time. Although I encourage you to make time because, you know, if you concede some offense or a key argument that the affirmative has laid out, then there goes your T shell. Another tip when extending T, I would suggest you get into the habit of having the 1 and R. If you're a 1 and R, learn how to extend T. The reason being is that the 1 and R is the most undervalued speech in a debate, or yeah, right? And that tends to be because the 2 and R tends to go for whatever the 2 and R wants or whatever the 2 and R is comfortable going with. And the 1 and R is sometimes just there. But if you use the 1 and R strategically, right, like extending and just using those full 5 minutes to just talk about T and go by the line by line and just making a case why T is important, you're in a way better position because, you know, the 2NC should maybe extend something differently, but the 1AR has 5 minutes to extend the block. So make sure that you're making strategic use of the time in the block. Okay, so here's an example, right, of how your voters can overlap. So when I asked a question, can fairness lead to education? Can education lead to fairness? Right, so here's an example. Let's say that the negative in the 2NC 1 and R overemphasizes fairness. They say that you should reject the affirmative because it's unfair definition and it leads to a, I don't know, an overwhelming research burden that's just makes it impossible to debate and it makes it impossible to be negative. The affirmative gets up and says, well, our education that the app provides outweighs, right, the harm of you not being able to debate the 1AC because of whatever reason. The 1AC could provide portable skills that are important for folks or specific things that the app has that are super educational, that are beneficial. The affirmative can say that should outweigh the fairness question. The negative can take an approach of explaining how the fairness is key to education. So here, now you're elaborating a little bit more. Instead of saying you're unfair for research and we couldn't talk about the affirmative or we couldn't talk about this, period, that's why it's bad, right? You could also make the case that fairness leads to education or leads to better education, right? In this case, fairness can limit the discussion, and limiting the discussion leads to predictability. Predictability leads to clash, and clash, as I said earlier, leads to education, okay? You can make these connections. So if the app is like, I'm important because education outweighs, you can be like, well, fairness is key to education. And then you explain why that's the case, right? The second thing, right, you can also say fairness is better for ground and clash, and then also key to education, right? All of this is the impact work that should be done in the 1NR or 2NC or the 2NR, okay? Another tip for extending T and the impacts is by using the words of, using the affirmative's words against them, right? So if they say, for example, oh, we're key to portable skills and teaching people how to, I don't know, survive police brutality, I don't know, right? Then you can maybe make the case that, listen, maybe we could also combat police brutality if we're able to have clash debates because we're able to talk about the nitty grittiness of policymaking, thus making it better for education and more better for, I don't know, helpful for survival strategies. I don't know, but using the wording of the affirmative in your interpretation or discussion of the voter will make it a really persuasive case for the judge when going for T. Okay, now for the 2NR, the 2NR, in order to win T, right, you have to, again, extend the interpretation of the 1NC 1NR, explain why your interpretation is best for either debate or education or both, right? And why your voters outweigh, and let's not forget the line by line, because as Joseph mentioned earlier, the AF tends to lie a lot, right? So make sure that you protect lots of arguments by saying, hey, don't allow new arguments, right? But like I said, make sure that you're fleshing out the voters. Another thing to keep in mind, we're going for T in the 2NR. If you're going for T in the 2NR, then T is the only thing you should be going in the 2NR, period. No case, no K or disad or whatever. T. You have to make a strategic choice that you are going for T. Because here, right, here the debate is less so about the content of the affirmative, like the specific policy or the specific advocacy statement solvency question or the harms, right? Like the dissad argues the harms and the plan of the affirmative or the solvency question of the affirmative. The counter plan talks about the content, about the whatever it may be. All of those discussions go out the window when you are arguing that the affirmative has misused a word, right? And that the resolution or T is an a priori issue or is a issue that comes before anything else, because how can we have a debate about solvency when really your form is off, or when your structure or the way that you have set up the debate is off and problematic, right? That's why T should be the only thing that you go for in the twin R. And also it's more persuasive. Like you can't just be like, your interpretation is unfair and blah, 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 when you're over here extending your dissad, your K-links, or whatever it may be. It kind of takes away from the persuasiveness of the T argument, right? So make sure that if you go for T, you only go for T, period. And as I said earlier, make sure that you try to use the language of the affirmative offense in order to extend your interpretation or argue how your interpretation is able to resolve some of the affirmative offense. Like if you can do that in a twin R, your T debates will sound a lot like really, really good. Really persuasive at least, okay? And really quickly, I'm sure you can talk about this more in lab, but how to answer topicality, right? Okay, so one word really, blocks. You need blocks, 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 right? And your block should have the following. They need all four things. Four things are a must, right? Is one, we meet. Two, you need a counter interpretation. And make sure that your counter interpretation is relevant to your affirmative. I've had some debates where the AF doesn't meet their own counter interpretation. So make sure that you pick a definition that your AF is okay with, right? Because it'll be a little awkward if the neg is like, you don't meet your own interpretation either, right? Make sure that you also provide reasons why your interpretation is preferable, and also have voters, right? Reasons to prefer, or the impact to preferring yours over the negatives, right? And lastly, when you're answering T, make sure that you impact turn T, right? What I mean by that is that if the affirmative is, or if the negative is like, we're better for fairness, right? Impact turning is like, actually, you're worse for fairness, and here's why. If they're like, we're better for education because we lead to clash, actually, you're worse for education for these reasons. Okay, that's what it means to turn a voter, or to impact turn the voters on T. All right, but that's it for today. I hope that was helpful, and I hope some of y'all are encouraged to extend T. Just as just like the UDL debates that I've judged, at least, most of y'all just tend to have the 1 and C, and the debates never go beyond the 1 and C on T. But I encourage you to try and extend T in future speeches, right? Because like I said, T could be a helpful strategy against maybe AFs that you weren't ready to debate because you didn't know that you had to be ready for those affirmatives. So what do you do in that case? Do you just forfeit, right? So make sure that you have, make sure that you try and be comfortable with arguing T in future debates, right? But that's it for my presentation, right? If you have any questions, I'm sure your lab leaders can answer them, or just feel free to drop a message somewhere in Discord. I'm sure my name pops up in there somewhere if you have specific questions. But yeah, have fun.